Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this session we're going to teach you how you can add parameters to your stored procedures in Microsoft SQL Server. What we'll cover in this session is all about how to work with parameters in stored procedures. We'll begin with an introduction to what parameters actually are, and then talk to you about how you can create parameters and add them to your stored procedures. We'll talk about how you execute stored procedures which include parameters and how you can pass values back to them. And we'll move on then and show you how you can work with optional parameters and provide default values. We'll finish this tutorial with a quick look at how you can then use your stored procedures in other applications such as SQL Server reporting services. So let's get started. In a previous tutorial video, we've shown you how you can create basic stored procedures which simply encapsulate a basic select statement. When you execute that type of stored procedure, it's simply as though you'd run the simple select statement in the first place. In this video, we're going to expand on that idea and allow you to provide parameters to your stored procedures when you execute them. The idea being that every time you execute a stored procedure, you can pass in a different piece of information, one or more bits of information in fact, that will affect the results returned. If I change the value in this simple single parameter and execute the procedure again, I'll get a completely different set of results. So that's the idea. For our first example, we're going to write a stored procedure which accepts a single parameter when we execute it. And the data type is going to be some kind of number, and the number that we pass in each time we execute the procedure is going to be used to filter our list of films based on the running time in minutes. So let's go about converting this simple select statement into a create procedure statement. I'm going to write create proc above the select statement. I'm going to call it SP film criteria, and then below that the word as, and that's actually all that I really need to do at this point. Just a quick reminder, if you watched our earlier video on basic stored procedures, that you can also optionally add a begin and end block to your procedure creating statements. It's not necessary in this example, simply because our stored procedure only consists of a single statement. There it is. But in future, when you're writing more complex procedures involving many statements, the begin and the end block is useful, so it's worthwhile getting into the habit early. So now that we have the basic procedure outline, the next step is to start adding a parameter to it. Now the list of parameters always appears in a set of round brackets or parentheses immediately after the procedure's name. So after the SP film criteria, you can simply open a set of round brackets and then begin to list your parameters. Now all parameter names must begin with an @ symbol. So I'm going to write an @ symbol and then think of a sensible name for my parameter. I'm going to call it min length, I think. There we go, min length will do. I also have to specify what kind of data that parameter will be allowed to contain. So I can do that with an as keyword, min length as, and in this case I'm going to use the data type of int, which is short for integer, which is any whole number. I can then close round brackets, and that's my list of parameters created. In a couple of later examples we'll add further parameters to this list, so you can see how you work with multiple parameters. Now, there's not much point in creating a parameter unless we're actually going to use it. So what we're going to do now is add a where clause to our select statement, and we're going to use that parameter's value in the criterion. So I'm going to ask where the film's runtime in minutes is greater than whatever value has been passed in through this parameter. All I need to do now is execute this script to create the stored procedure, and if I do that, there it is, commands completed successfully, and I should be able to have a look for the procedure in my Object Explorer. If I expand the Databases folder and expand the Movies database and the Programmability folder and Store Procedures, and there it is, SP Film Criteria. So now that we've created the procedure, we need to execute it in order to see its results. Now, because I've added a parameter to this procedure, I can't use the old trick of simply selecting its name in the script that I used to create it and choosing to execute it. I'll be provided with a message saying that it's missing an expected parameter at min length. So what I need to do instead is create a new query window and write the exec or execute statement. Exec SP film criteria, which is the name of my stored procedure, And again, if I try to execute it at this point, then I'd be informed with the same message. I've not provided a parameter that's expected. So what I need to do is provide a value for the min length parameter, which must be a number. I'm typing the value of 180. And if I execute that procedure now, I'll get a list of all of the films whose runtime in minutes is greater than the value that I've provided. If I modify this piece of information here and execute the query again, I'll get a different set of results, and that will happen every single time I run the store procedure. So now we've seen the basics of creating parameters in a store procedure. Let's go back and add a couple more. If you've still got the script open which you used to create this procedure in the first place, you can happily come back to this one. Alternatively, if you'd closed that one down and hadn't saved the changes, you can simply head back to the Object Explorer, right-click on the name of your store procedure, and choose to modify it. And that'll open up the page again with the alter statement rather than the create statement. I'm going to get rid of these extra lines that we don't need to consider in our script. And there we go, alter procedure, SP film criteria, and we're ready to go. Quick reminder of the red underlining that you'll often see when you're using the IntelliSense feature. It doesn't refresh automatically immediately when you create new procedures. So at the moment this film criteria procedure isn't actually recognised. To force the IntelliSense to recognise that keyword, you can head to the edit menu, choose IntelliSense, and then choose to refresh the local cache, or just simply press Ctrl and Shift and R on your keyboard, and that should, after a brief pause, clear the red underlining. It's not a big issue, just if it annoys you, you can simply clear it by doing that. So now we're ready to start adding new parameters to our current procedure. And to do that, all I really need to do is type a comma after the first parameter and then make up a new name for the next parameter. So simply build a comma separated list, much like the select list when you're listing field names or column names. Now when I'm doing this, I like to create a slightly more easy to read layout. So what I'm going to do is take the parameter list onto a different line first of all and indent that by pressing the tab key. I'm also going to take the list of parameters onto individual separate lines as well. So leave the brackets or the parentheses by themselves on their own separate lines, and then what we'll end up with is very similar to the way that I structure my select lists. You have one parameter on one line, and on the next line, beginning with a comma, the name of the next parameter. The next parameter we're going to create is going to be called at max length, and it's going to have the same data type as the previous one. So it's going to be an integer. What I'm going to do then is add a new section to my my where clause in my select statement. I'm going to add a little operator there as well. I'm going to ask whether the film runtime in minutes is greater than or equal to the minimum length I've provided, and film runtime minutes is less than or equal to the max length that I've provided. All I need to do now is execute this page to alter my procedure, and if I do that, hopefully I'll get the commands completed successfully message. I can then head back to the test procedure if you like. If I try to run this one again now, it's not going to work. It's going to give me the same message as I saw earlier on. It's expecting a parameter which was not supplied. So all I need to do is type in a comma after my first parameter, add a new value, a new integer, and when I execute the procedure now, I'll get a list of all the films whose runtime is between 150 and 180. I just want to make a quick note about naming your parameters. When you're providing multiple bits of information to the same store procedure, sometimes it's not very obvious what those numbers are meant to represent. So if you know the names of your parameters, you can actually name them when you call the store procedure. In fact, in this version of SQL Server 2012, the tooltip will pop up to show you the list of parameters that you've created and what data types they're supposed to contain. So if I just carry on here, I'm going to say at min length equals 150, and then I can say also at max length equals 180. So you simply name the parameter before you provide its value, It doesn't affect the way the procedure works, it just makes things a little bit more obvious for people reading your statements. Okay, so we've created a couple of parameters which accept a simple number. For the next example, let's be a bit more ambitious. What I'd also like to be able to do in this example, this criteria procedure, is pass in a piece of text and then to return any film whose name contains that piece of text. So in order to do that, I'm going to head back to the same page that I left open earlier on, which has my alter procedure statement. And let me just drag this window down a little bit. I'm going to add a third parameter into my parameters list, which I'm going to call at title as, and it's going to be some kind of text. I'm going to go for varchar max, so that allows me to type in the maximum length of characters. What I need to do now is add a new part to my where clause, which will take in this title parameter and search for any film name which contains that piece of text. It's going to have another and I'm going to ask where the film name is like. So remember, I'm not asking for something that's equal to this title that I type in. I want to find anything that is like that title. So let's just imagine for a moment that I typed in the word star when I call my procedure. Normally when I'm doing this, if you were writing this out as a basic select statement, you'd enclose your piece of text in a set of single quotes surrounded by the percentage symbols, which act as wildcard characters. So this would find any film whose name contains the word star, surrounded on either side by any length of any characters. Now obviously that's not going to work here. I need to refer to my at title parameter, but I can't get away with simply replacing the single word star with at title, because what would happen now is that the SQL Server would look for any film whose name contains the word at title within its name. So what I need to do is use a little bit of concatenation. So I need to join on each percentage symbol. So each percentage symbol goes into its own set of single quotes. And I need to join those to the title parameter using a plus symbol. So the end result, when those three parts are placed together, it effectively recreates what I showed you earlier on, where you have the word star surrounded on either side with wildcard characters. So let's give that one a whirl. I'm going to execute this script to alter my procedure one more time. And I should have a new parameter now called at title. So if I go back to my other page, which is calling my store procedure, I should be able to type in another comma at the end. This time I'm going to say at title equals the word star, and if I execute this procedure, oh, I don't get anything. Maybe I haven't got any films whose duration is between 150 and 180 minutes. Let's try 120 minutes instead. There we go. That was a little bit worrying for a moment. So there we go, all films containing the word star with a duration between 120 and 180 minutes. Okay, so now that we've seen how to add several parameters to our store procedures, it should be fairly easy for you to work out how to add even more. You can simply build up this list, making sure you choose a sensible name and the sensible data type for each parameter, and then build them into the where clause when you want to make use of them. What I'd like to focus on next is how we can start to make our parameters optional. So rather than being forced to provide all three parameters every time I execute this procedure, I want to make each of these parameters optional. The first step in making a parameter optional is to give it a default value. And you can do that in the parameters list in the definition of your store procedure. So let's start with the minimum length. I think we know that the minimum length of any film would theoretically be 0 minutes, I suppose. So what we could do is simply provide a value for this parameter equal to 0. And it really is as simple as that. If I execute my procedure now, my page to alter my procedure, and then go back to the page that I've been using to test it, at the moment everything will work just as it has previously. If I provide a value for my procedure, let's change the name maybe so we can see a different set of results. So there we go, there's all films containing the word die with a minimum length of 120 minutes. But now that I've given this parameter and a default value, I should simply be able to take this away and then execute the procedure again, and I'll get a completely different set of results. No, almost completely different. There's one extra result. So having failed to provide a value for the minimum length, the procedure is using the value of 0 instead. Now that style of creating an optional argument is great as long as you can choose a sensible value for the default. So if I go back to my store procedure script again, we know for a fact that the minimum length of a film logically must be 0. But how would we choose a sensible example, a sensible default value for the maximum length? Because we don't know what the maximum length of a film could be, and that value could also change if further films are added to the database. So rather than using absolute values for your default values for your parameters, what you can do instead is assign a value of null to your parameters. Now the downside to doing this, although it helps you because you don't have to predict what your default values must be, the downside is that you have to do something to the where clause to handle the value of null. So if a user hasn't provided a value, we need to add an extra little statement to the where clause. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to replace my value of 0 for the min length as well with null, to show you how much extra work that involves. So the first thing we have to do is for each of the parameters whose value is being set to null, we need to add an extra condition to the where clause, which will test if that parameter is still equal to null. So I'm going to ask if at min length is null, or the relevant column, in this case film runtime minutes, is greater than or equal to the value of that parameter. Because these two conditions I want to evaluate together, I'm actually going to add in a set of parentheses which will enclose those two logical tests. So when I run my store procedure, I'm going to check to see if the min length parameter is null, then that will return a result, or it's going to check for any films whose runtime in minutes is greater than or equal to the value that I've provided. I need to do the same thing now for each of my other optional parameters. Fortunately in this case there's only one other one, so I'm going for at max length is null, or film runtime minutes is less than or equal to the value of that parameter. It's a little bit of extra effort, but in the long run I think it's worth it. It means you don't have to predict what the actual values for your parameters might be, so you never run into the danger of underestimating or overestimating values. So if we execute this script one more time to modify my store procedure, we should now be able to head back to the test script, and I should be able to actually omit both my min and max length arguments. If I take both of those away, all I really need to do is provide the title argument, and if I execute the store procedure now, I'll get exactly the same list again, of course. Let's try it one more time with a different name, and there we go. So I've got any film whose name contains the word star, and the min and max runtimes are completely irrelevant. It's anything from 0 to an infinite number, effectively. So hopefully this video showed you how useful store procedures can be. Rather than you having to write out many different examples of the same query with different criteria, you can have one single store procedure which allows you to pass in a number of parameters which will affect the results every single time you call it. Just a quick hint just to finish off for people who use reporting services on top of SQL Server. If you've created store procedures with parameters, and we've got lots and lots of videos about how to do this actually, but I've got a basic basic report here in reporting services, and if you've got a store procedure in the database you're connecting to, you can actually use that store procedure to populate a data set. So what I've got here is a connection to my movies database, the one that I've just been working on, and if I create a new data set, I can choose to use a stored procedure from that database to populate the results of this report. So there we go, there's my store procedure, SP film criteria. If I choose OK, I'll get not only the field names from that store procedure, the film name and runtime in minutes, but also any parameters that are included in there. So if I just set up a basic table to display the results very quickly, and then when I preview my report, what I'm going to see is that any parameters that were contained in the stored procedure itself are also going to be displayed when I run the report to let a user modify the results. And there we go. So if I type in a couple of quick numbers here, let's go for 100 to 120, and I'm going to type in, I don't know, let's go for star again because I know that one works. When I choose to view my report, eventually, there we go. So the stored procedure works equally well in some sort of front-end system as it does at the database level. So that hopefully gives you a couple of useful ideas for things you can do in the future. If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.